Morning class. Today we're going to cover the humanist theory, the trait theories, and the social cognitive theories. Before the humanist, there was the behaviorist. We have talked about behaviorism a lot in this class. If you guys remember, this is just a reminder, behaviorism basically says that you are your environment. So according to behaviorists, your personality is nothing more or less than behaviors that you have been taught by your environment. Okay, so moving on to the humanist theories. The humanists had two really big names behind it, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. The idea behind humanists is that people will grow to be healthy people if they just receive basic support from the environment. The humanist was all about self-determination, self-realization, free will. So they were all about the potential for human growth, and they thought that humans would inevitably make the best decisions as long as the environment was supportive. Maslow's big contribution to the field was his idea of his hierarchy of needs. He basically says that humans first need their basic needs met, and once they have their basic needs met, they need their psychological needs met, and then they can achieve what he called self-actualization, which is our ultimate potential. So first we need basic things, food, water, sleep, etc. Then we need to feel safe, and then we need to feel as if we belong, and then we need to feel a sense of accomplishment in something that we personally do, and then we could go on to be creative. There's been a lot of research done with this particular idea. Thus far, we don't have enough evidence to say that this hierarchy of needs actually exists. Carl Rogers' contribution is the idea of unconditional positive regard. He thought that in order for a person to be healthy psychologically, they needed to feel loved and accepted for who they are without any conditions. One of the criticisms of his approach is that perhaps this is a little overly simplistic, or perhaps this is a little overly optimistic. But he really felt that we could and should do this. He says that the thing that causes problems is conditions of worth, basically telling someone that in order to be viewed as worthy by me, you have to meet my demands, you have to meet my expectations. Carl Rogers also talked about the difference between the real self and the ideal self. The real self is who we are, our talents, abilities, etc. Our ideal self is who we want to be. As long as there's a lot of overlap between the real self and ideal self, then we are psychologically happy. The problems comes when our real self and our ideal self are far apart. This causes a lot of anxiety and depression. Okay. The humanist theory has been criticized for being, again, overly optimistic, and for being kind of vague, and for focusing on the individual, that could maybe lead to selfishness. But again, the humanist theory, even though it's not around today, it did lay the groundwork for positive psychology and for studying happiness. Trait theories talks about who we are is basically just a collection of the traits that we exhibit. So what is a trait? A trait is a pattern of behavior that goes across different situations. So whether you're nice, whether you're funny, whether you're mean, whether you're sarcastic, these are the collection of traits that make up who you are in terms of personality. Evidence supports that there's probably a biological basis for many traits. One of the instances that we see this is, for example, in the trait of introversion versus extroversion. What you see is a difference in frontal lobe activities. Extroverts' brains get bored easily, whereas introverts' brains don't need a lot of activity from the environment in order to stay very active. And this trait, whether you have a brain that needs a lot of stimulation or a little stimulation, is probably hereditable. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is perhaps not perhaps, it is the best personality test that we have to date. It is very reliable, is very valid, it has been tested multiple times. The only difficulty with the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is that it is only meant to pick up abnormal behaviors. So if you have no abnormalities in terms of your personality, the only thing the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Test is going to tell me is that you're normal, which is kind of boring, but is a very good test in terms of picking up abnormalities. The Big Five personality traits. They're called the Big Five for a couple of reasons. One is because these 5 traits tend to be evident in every culture across the globe. Also, these traits are relatively stable from the time you're a very small child throughout your adulthood. Everyone you meet is going to fall somewhere on these 5 traits: conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. Conscientiousness basically says, are you a planner? Do you like to plan things? Do you like to have agendas? Or are you more impulsive? Agreeableness, do you like to get along? Do you like to agree? Or do you enjoy an argument? Neuroticism has to do with emotions. Are you emotionally stable? Or are you up and down a lot? Openness basically means how open you are to new experiences. Do you like to try things? Or are you very traditional? And again, introversion versus extroversion, where do you get your energy? Do you get energy from being around people, or do you perform more solitary activities? This slide just shows the continuum of the Big Five. Again, everyone who you meet will fall somewhere along this continuum. The last big theory we're going to talk about is the social cognitive perspective. According to Albert Bandura, his big contribution was this idea of reciprocal determinism. The idea that yes, our environment does influence us, yes, our peers influence us, but we also influence our environment. So do our friends have an impact on our attitudes, our behaviors, etc.? Absolutely. But who picks our friends? So there's a constant two-way interaction between our environment and the individual. This slide just kind of shows the interaction between our personality, our behavior, and environmental factors. There's a constant interaction going on between these things that influences our attitudes, our behaviors, etc. The self is the center of our personality. Basically, it's the part that organizes all other aspects of our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors. Perhaps more than any other topic in psychology, trying to understand the self has received more attention and research than anything else. In terms of the self, really interesting, this is something that we've talked about before. The spotlight effect is something that happens generally in our adolescent years, and it disappears later on. The spotlight effect is this idea that everyone is paying attention and focused on us. So everyone is evaluating how we dress, how we behave, our attitudes. Everyone is focused on us. Really interesting, during the time when we are most susceptible to the spotlight effect, this is also the time where we start to consider our possible selves, who we would develop into. So what are my talents? Where can they lead me? For example, this could also lead to the formation of our career goals and choices. So this is very interesting aspects of who we are and how we develop. So what's the difference between self-esteem and self-efficacy? Self-esteem is our overall feelings of self-worth. Self-efficacy is my belief that I can do a particular skill competently. So self-esteem is more global. Self-efficacy is more specific. high self-esteem has been correlated with less pressure to perform, overall happiness, less depression, less anxiety, all good things. Self-efficacy is correlated with our tendency to persist in a particular skill. So if we believe that we can do something well, we tend to persist in it, and we actually tend to do well in it. The self-serving bias is our tendency to take responsibility when we do something well. We say, yay us. However, when we fail, we tend to make excuses for our failures. What the self-serving bias does for us, it protects our self-esteem, keeps us from having to own all of our failures. So the self-serving bias does serve a purpose. However, when it's overused, it can be counterproductive. Basically, when the self-serving bias is overused, then a person never takes responsibility for their failures, and they never learn from them. So self-serving bias can be negative. Narcissism is one of the things that can happen if we overuse the self-serving bias. Narcissism is excessive self-love and self-absorption. So a person's feelings of self is kind of shaky. It's very dependent upon external feedback. So if they're criticized, they tend to respond to criticism very negatively, very defensively. So they cannot hear any criticism. Their pride is actually not rooted in actual achievements, but in extraneous peripheral things. All right. This is my last one. The culture that we live in also plays a big role in our personality. In individualist cultures, the focus is more on the self, and we tend to prioritize our own needs above the needs of the group. Whereas in collectivist cultures, the focus is more on identifying with your group. So a person gets self-esteem and pride when their group does well, as opposed to when they do well. This is the last slide here. It is kind of a table that shows how coping, morality, relationships, etc. Differ when we have an individualist culture, such as the one we're currently living in, versus a collectivist culture. For example, cultures typically in Asian and African descent.